Hello. Welcome to another Friday that we are experiencing. Today I'm going to be talking about Shocker, a book, and shocker, because you've probably looked at the title, that book is Honey Girl by Morgan Rogers. So in this book, we follow our protagonist Grace, and we first encounter her as she is waking up in Vegas from that kind of quintessential Vegas night that lives in pop culture infamy, where she has gotten drunkenly married. But for Grace, this is very abnormal. Grace has just finished a really demanding astronomy PhD program. She's actually in Vegas with her friends celebrating her doctorate, which is a huge thing to celebrate, and just letting loose for the first time in years. So the narrative pulls us as readers into the kind of morning after, the dawning. It's very atmospheric, and we see the leaving, like one of the lovers leaving, in this case Yuki, because Grace is left in the room. And we're introduced to the concept of Grace being her honey girl. And then she leaves. And this night that we only get recollections of in almost like champagne popped bubbles is gone. And Grace has to go back to the reality of her life, which is figuring out what she wants to do post doctorate and figuring out her life. She's coming up on her 29th birthday, and she has spent, the entirety of her life to this point chasing this very specific goal and dream. And now that she has gotten it, the PhD, she's faced with the great unknown of her future, which is such a beautiful juxtaposition, well, not juxtaposition, parallel, that is set up by the author in terms of space and the way space comes up again and again as kind of this mirror of how Grace is interacting with her life, and just the metaphor that is there to mine. Like, I don't think I've cried about the Mars rover for a hot second, but this book made me cry about the Mars rover again, that my battery is low and it's getting dark moment. And that's kind of where Grace is. Her battery is low and it is getting dark. She has spent so long pushing through the expectation of this PhD program that now that she's faced with having to continue to fight, she's just exhausted by the idea because it doesn't stop. And she knew she was going to have to work ridiculously hard for this program, both for the rigor of the program itself and then being one of the, if not the only Black woman in the program. And then to get to that finish line and then realize that that's going to continue, that you're going to have to keep going and keep fighting, is so hard. This idea of needing that control and needing to succeed, and the idea of anything less than the absolute best being failure. And this was also balanced by the family and friendships that were in Grace's life. She had wonderful, supportive friends, but she didn't always completely open herself up to them in the sense that they were always there for her, but she kind of held a lot of herself back. And she was dealing with both a very demanding father with a military background, so there's some distance there in how they interact with each other, and a kind of flighty hippie mom who's just not in the picture in a real long-term way, though that relationship is explored. Both relationships are explored further in the book. So Grace kind of has this moment where she's like, I don't know what I'm going to be doing with my life. And she runs after her wife to New York City because she's from Portland. So she goes off to New York after her wife and tries to run away, basically. And so this is really interesting because this book was gorgeous, but the way it has been framed as a romance, I think is interesting. And I think, like I said, based on reviews that I'd read going in, at my anticipated reads video, if you are going for a more traditional romance, I think you're going to be disappointed as a reader in a way that if you aren't going in with those expectations, you won't be, because this is a really gorgeous coming of age at almost 30 book. But to classify it as a romance, like, yes, there is a romance at its heart, but the romance isn't the focus in that. Stay with me for a second. In a romance, even when you're dealing with really hard things, because romances absolutely do, and characters have to overcome certain things in their own journeys to make the relationship work, at the end of the day, the relationship is kind of the emotional center of the book. And here, Grace is very much the emotional center of the book. We get some really great stuff with Yuki. We know she has her radio show and she's kind of focused on monsters and this idea that they're both these two lonely hearts kind of coming together and finding each other in the darkness and the unknown. It's really beautiful imagery, and it absolutely, that relationship is gorgeous. But it's more about how that relationship impacts Grace and Grace's journey and helps her find herself than the relationship itself. Because we see them together, but scenes are more about revealing things about Grace to Grace. And the tone of the book is a lot slower and more reflective than I traditionally think of with romances. It kind of goes back to the idea of this book really focusing on Grace and Grace feeling lost and finding herself. There's a moment in the book where she says, I feel like if I stop, I'll miss my chance. So it kind of is this moment both in her life as a character and how it's written and approached, in that she's been go, 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 push, push, push for so long. And now she's having to kind of take a step back and sit in some stillness that she never has. And the narrative sits us in that stillness a little bit more. It is much more reflective. It's a little bit more legato. And this also obviously is a little bit my experience because I listened to the audiobook rather than doing it in print. So I experienced it as, a listener, and it kind of just like washed over me. But again, yeah, this is very much Grace's journey. We don't even really get Grace in New York. We don't get Grace with Yuki specifically until about 40% in. In a traditional romance, I would expect that to happen much sooner. So I think that really just reinforces structurally that this is Grace's journey. And it's a gorgeous, heartfelt, touching journey. Like, I really, really felt for Grace specifically. Now, because the narrative was a little slower and more reflective, it really leaned into the kind of existential crisis metaphors, right, of space, and then with Yuki's radio show of hunting the unknown and the monsters of the world, and again searching for that connection with lost, lonely souls. And I worried that was going to become too much, too on the nose, not necessarily didactic because it wasn't trying to forward a particular worldview, but I worried a little bit. But I never really felt it. I was waiting for the moment where I was going to be over it, and I really wasn't. And I think it's because we were so invested, or at least personally, because again, I can only speak to my personal reading journey at the end of the day, was so invested in Grace's story that it felt like something that she was working through. And it also felt like the things that you would read, on Twitter at 2 a.m. when you're trying to figure out your life and you're trying to find a real connection out there, or you're just kind of like, who else is up? What am I missing from the world? I will say this too, Yuki's radio show, because at one point I was like, did I mishear? Does she have a podcast? But no, it was described as a radio show. And so I was playing with like the throwback imagery of that and what exactly the fact that she had a radio show versus, any other modern iteration may mean. I don't know that I really came to any conclusions. To swing back to like kind of like the romance angle and how all of this kind of like combines. There is a moment where they kind of like make a Harlequin joke, which was funny because I think this is a Harlequin imprint published book, obviously not a serial, but it was still funny. But at one point, I think it's Grace, but I just typed it on my phone while listening. So she says, I want to have just one thing in my life that's easy, that I don't have to fight for, because she's got all of these external things that she's fighting for. So this relationship is kind of her escape. And again, to go back to like the romance part of it, in romance, the relationship is what we are fighting for. And so I don't know, kind of like that give and take there. And that line hit me. I loved it. This book is really a gorgeous character study, but it's very much a character-driven novel. It's very much an internally driven novel, and it's very reflective, but has a nice kind of legato pace to it in that it deals with really hard, heavy, important things, but it just kind of washes over you at the same time. That sounds like a diminishment in a way that I do not intend it. I also thought a lot while listening. Again, okay, so I listened to this, and I haven't been struggling with audiobooks recently. Like, I've listened to some good ones recently, but I haven't been just busting through audio in the way that I have in the past. And again, I've talked a little bit about how some of that is my job situation and that I just can't listen in the way I used to. But I found myself, because this just came out, just like sitting in bed or like on my couch after work, just listening to this book at extended hours in a way that I generally don't do. I'm usually like trying to do something at the same time because I didn't want to stop listening. I think that has to be given as a strength to the book, especially in something that's so reflective, right? It would be easy to put it down and come back to it and put it down and come back to it. But somehow, even with this slower pace, it kept me hooked constantly. And it had really beautiful language, and how that language fit together audibly was wonderful. I will also say, in terms of audiobooks, it made me think of another audiobook that I read last year, Real Life by Brandon Taylor, in that it kind of dealt with a lot of similar themes in like mirror ways. So this was kind of like a more literary romantic version of like Brandon Taylor took a more like straight literary realism take on it, but it was really exploring what it means to be Black in white predominated fields in academia, what it means to be Black in academia, period, what that struggle is, and the constant push, as well as just finding yourself and learning to adjust your goals and expectations and what will bring you personal fulfillment as you get older, when you have spent so much time and dedicated and sacrificed so much time for a very specific, concrete goal, and whether that goal is achieved or not. So I think that if you liked Honey Girl or if you liked Real Life, either one, like, definitely give the other one a chance. Obviously, one is much more romantic than the other, because even though the romance isn't, I would argue, the central conceit of this book, it is still such an important part and lovely part of this book, because I think it too explores how romantic love, how you can find yourself in romantic love in a way where many make the argument that you can lose yourself in romantic love. And I think that argument could be made at first for Grace, right? She was looking to lose herself. She was looking to escape. And then how that can morph and change. So I think that it's just really, really lovely. There's just so much to dig into and play with and explore. And all of it is wrapped in this really lush language. So Yeah, I would really recommend this book. It was a delight and a surprise, but again, I am glad that I read reviews that helped me adjust my expectations for the reading experience so that I could experience the book as it is rather than go in and judge it for what I wanted it to be, if that makes sense. Again, it's a much slower, it's a crock pot novel. It's a slow burn. It's a steady, low heat all across the board that then all of a sudden you have this delicious meal at the end. And yes, I just made a really, really dumb crock pot reference there. So that's how we're going to end. So let me know what you thought of Honey Girl. If you've read it, read something good, and yeah, bye.